The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello.
Hello, are you ready?
I am always ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready. So good evening, everyone. As you know, I am Amie. I'm very excited to be here tonight. It's a pleasure spending time to have this conversation with you and talking about the complexities of, healthcare and particularly emergency medicine. I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about emergency medicine. So as you know, Dr. Brian Goldman's the host of CBC's White Coat Black Art, and that's how I first came to know you, because I listened to Dr. Brian Goldman when I was a nursing student. So I'm pretty up here myself. So let's talk a little bit about your book. So The Casino Shift is a gripping hour-by-hour look at the healthcare system where the stakes are higher than ever. And I'd say that the house doesn't play fair. Would you say?
The house doesn't play fair with your health, unfortunately. I can't tell you how often I'm seeing these days 30 and 40-something people who are finding out that they've got stage 3 or stage 4 cancer.
Yep.
So the house doesn't play fair with your health, and certainly the system doesn't play fair with us emergency folk. And I know you worked in the ER, so
Yes.
you know what I'm talking about.
It does not play fair, but let's get into some of the questions today. So what really inspired you to write The Casino Shift? For those who haven't worked in the graveyard shift, what makes it feel like a casino? Is it the high stakes? Is it the lack of clocks? They don't pump oxygen in the air in the emergency department, unfortunately. But what makes it, tell me a little bit about how you came to write The Casino Shift.
So first of all, two things. The casino shift is only in passing about a game of chance. It's not really a game of chance. It's called the casino shift because we have borrowed a kind of shift from casino workers, right. and I guess that's one thing that we have in common. Casino workers and first responders, emergency physicians, emergency nurses, RTs, respiratory therapists. We have to work 24 hours a day. And a casino shift is an idea that we borrowed from them. Casino shift is a split night shift. So basically, in its purest form, you either work from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m., or you work from 4 a.m. till 10 a.m., and I know it sounds crazy. It doesn't sound much better than a night shift, but it really is, because you end up sleeping for 2 or 3 hours in your own bed every night, right, which is important, and you get an extra 2 or 3 hours during the day to be out and about, getting sunlight, which you need to resynchronize your cardiac, your circadian rhythms, and the it's sleep depriving because as we get older, it doesn't get easier to sleep in, but I can tell you it's less debilitating than doing night shifts, and you don't get that kind of perpetual cognitive fog that you have when you do night shifts. So I can tell you, this was invented at QE2 Health Sciences Center in Halifax, and once they switched to casino shifts, the doctors there said, I don't want to go back and do a night shift. So that seemed like the logical title for the sequel. You've written one book, and I'm sure you're going to write 9 others. You don't want to repeat the same book you wrote before.
Definitely not.
So my first thought, my editor is your editor, Brad Wilson. This is not a setup. This is just a coincidence.
Yes.
I can tell you that when he pitched the idea of me doing a sequel to The Night Shift, my first thought was, I hate sequels. Right. They're boring. You're repeating yourself. Except that a couple of things have happened. We have had an explosion of technology, which we're going to talk about. Medicine is different. The patients still have illnesses, but boy, the world has changed. And I get a chance to describe what's going on in emergency medicine at a moment when people are, for the first time, using the word collapse to describe the emergency department, the emergency system. And I thought, you know what? This is my chance to put my statement, my stamp on what's going on and get people, these good people who are here to hear about the book and maybe read the book to ask themselves, what kind of an emergency department do I want? What kind of an emergency department will be there when I or a loved one need their help?
Yeah, I think that's actually very important, that we want to build a better healthcare system, a better emergency department. And again, we can't continue to go back. You're right. There was a 15-year gap between this book and your last one. So in your last memoir, The Night Shift, came out 15 years ago, like you said. So I'm going to ask you a question. In 2020, let's say that was the 2020 era, Brian, walked into the 2026 ER. What piece of advice would you give him?
Turn around and walk out. Buckle up. First of all, get used to working in the waiting room. We have now, it's not uncommon for us to start a shift with a half a dozen stretchers available. And I interviewed people for the book. One emergency physician, Dr. Caitlin Stockton, who actually sued the health authority.
Yep.
For non-support because she felt that she and her colleagues weren't getting the space that they needed to look after the patients they had. She described a shift where she started at 6 a.m. with 2 stretchers, and there were like 25 admitted patients. Wow. The patients started to crash. The ones who were admitted to hospital, she had to drop tools and start taking care of them, and then another critically ill patient, one after another, started arriving, and that's the situation that we're into. So I would tell my younger self to wear runners and to get used to working in the most abject of conditions. I mean, think about people. If you've ever been to an emergency department these days, if you've spent 12 hours in a waiting room, it's degrading. It can be abject. There are people who are 95 years old who have terrible abdominal pain, not critically ill, so they're going to have to wait their turn while other more critically ill patients get brought in. And they're suffering, and we can't do a proper history and physical. There's no privacy, and some of them just want to lie down, and sometimes they actually go to the floor, actually lay down on the floor. Yeah. And so that's the kind of world that I would want my younger self to be aware of.
Wow. I almost find that somewhat disheartening, though, because it's almost a little bit of a misnomer, right? I think about myself as a practicing nurse and knowing that there's so much more to do, but not nearly all of the tools and resources. And to tell myself, my younger self, to buckle up, I mean, I think that speaks to the current crisis that we're in. And it's concerning that would be the message, to be like, wear runners. It's going to be wild. And
that you're going to have to do a lot of jerry-rigging and improvising and finding quiet places in a waiting room. So maybe down the hall a little bit, there's a little alcove there. Maybe we can have a few private words without everybody else hearing, and never mind, the yelling and screaming. And sometimes, there are people who come in mental health crises. They may be speaking loudly. There may be security officers that are there that are going to kind of pull them away and do a body search to make sure that they're not carrying weapons, because that happens. At the same time, I would tell my younger self that my younger colleague, that your contemporaries, your new contemporaries, young like you, are just as passionate as they used to be. Yeah, there are rates of burnout, but they are finding gaps in the system, and they're finding ways of plugging those gaps. And they improvise, and they're trying under the most difficult of circumstances to do the best they can, and you'll be surprised at how often they get it right. The stories in the media are all about when they get it wrong, right? When bad things happen, but there aren't, they don't tell stories about the minor miracle that took place unless it's a strange human interest story. But
or
those
that near
happen
miss
too.
that you caught, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important, that to kind of give that little insight, to be like, it's going to be challenging. What would you say is the biggest difference you've seen within the last 10 to 15 years?
I would say that let's put it into 2 different buckets. The patients are different, so they're older. but they're not old. I've already told you that they're young people who are getting colorectal cancers sometimes as young as their 20s and 30s. And so there's that. They have complex illnesses. That means that they're living long enough to have chronic kidney disease and chronic heart disease and lung disease. Maybe they have some dementia, osteoporosis, and a whole bunch of other conditions. They're on 12 or 15 medications. I don't know how they keep track of all of them. And so that's one different kind of patient. We have now, it's estimated there are 6 million Canadians who lack primary care.
Yeah.
So they don't have a family doctor, or they don't have a nurse practitioner, and there are many millions more who can't get a timely appointment, like next day appointment with their family doctor or nurse practitioner if their lives depended on it. So what do? They can go to an urgent care. And they're not critically ill, and one thing I want to say is they're not taking stretchers away from the critically ill,
Right.
but they do take time, and they have no other place to go. And if you take somebody who hasn't had a family doctor, somebody could be 35 these days and have stage 4 colorectal cancer, and there wasn't anybody to do screening, to give them vaccinations, to monitor their blood pressure, to monitor their diabetes or their cholesterol, and now they come to us with all the complications. So we're seeing a lot of that. Plus, I work in downtown Toronto, so there are lots of patients who are unhoused. We've had a wonderful winter, haven't we? And wow, that was debilitating. I'm glad it's about freezing today. People who have substance use, opioid use disorders, mental health challenges. So one bucket are the patients who are different compared to 15 years ago. The other thing that's happening is technology. I can whip out. You may have seen in the emergency department, emergency physicians and nurses and nurse practitioners, physician assistants hauling around what looks like a giant laptop on a cart on wheels. Well, I can whip out a probe in my pocket, or in my fanny pack, and I can connect it to a smartphone, and I can use that ultrasound probe to look inside your heart, your lungs, your belly. And that's now a part of my physical examination.
Yeah.
That's a major. So the technology is different. In the night shift, I talked about how difficult it was, how challenging it was for me to learn how to intubate patients, and that involves putting a laryngoscope, which is a handle with either a rounded or a straight blade, over the patient's tongue, and kind of pulling the tongue out of the way so you can see the vocal cords, and then you thread the endotracheal tube through the vocal cords. And it can be hard to visualize the cords, and if you can't see them, you're not going to put it in blindly. Well, today they have mounted a fiber optic camera on the laryngoscope blade, so I insert it, and then I start looking on a giant monitor. And that giant monitor lights the way, and I can see it easily, and it's a lot easier to visualize the vocal cords. And there's lots of technology like that. We even have electronic ring cutters. If you break a finger and you have a beloved ring on your finger that has to be cut off, now we have an electronic ring cutter instead of the hand crank.
So there's good, and there's bad as well.
There's good and there's bad.
And I think I love the point that you touched on, because I think there's a lot of people that are still there's that gap between primary care and emergency care. And I always tell people, at the end of the day, if you need care and you need help, please do not go and get help. And we do need to have conversations about, health literacy, the use of the ED department. I've heard various slanderous things in terms of this person's abusing. I would never say in the state of how things are that anybody is abusing the system, but maybe it's just they don't know properly where to go.
Or they don't have a better place to go.
Or they don't have a better place to go.
In the case of primary care, it's obvious. There was a promise of great community resources, great community supports for people with mental health disorders. They emptied out the psychiatric hospitals, the long-term care psychiatric facilities, and the promise along with that, we're talking about 30, 40 years ago, that was going to be twinned or partnered with Better Community Services, which didn't happen. And so, again, people come to the emergency department because they don't have a better place to go. And I talked briefly about Dunn House. Dunn House is a fabulous facility. Andrew Buzari at UHN, University Health Network, has a passion for helping people who are unhoused by giving them a house, giving them a place to call their own. And it's not the first time that's been proven to work. People who are unhoused often will visit an emergency department 100 or 200 times a year. And that's because they tend not to have access to the kinds of treatments that they need. So he didn't just provide them with a house, through University Health Network. He provided them with a clinic, access to mental health services and physicians, primary care, right in the building. And so far, it's a smashing success. And when people are well cared for, they don't need to come to the emergency department. I don't know people who want to come to the emergency department because they like the place.
Right. It's not exactly a vacation spot.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you touched on, it's just kind of like, social medicine, the whole idea between housing, food insecurity, having income. It's just like, it's not revolutionary to say if someone has a wound but they don't have a place to wash it, that there's going to be more risk for infection, for harm, for poor outcomes, that you'll see them in the ED with a black toe. And then we go down that route as well. So again, you talked about the complexities and seeing that, we are seeing sicker patients. And I want to go back to something you mentioned, talking about the waiting room. How could we not talk about waiting? So many stories that have touched my own heart, that I've seen where people come to the ED and they wait. They wait for very long times. And, like you mentioned, that there's complexity of patients are sicker, sometimes that's their only option. But there is that gap where people are waiting for too long. We are in this world of hurry up and wait. But what continues to surprise me, and what might surprise others, is that there's not just hallway medicine, but there's waiting room medicine. When did we transition from hallway medicine to waiting room medicine, and how do we dedicate this transition space to this de facto treatment ward?
So this was not, I remember on White Coat Black Art, I went to the hallway in 2008 at Montreal Jewish General Hospital. And they showed me a corridor, like a series of corridors, where they'll have as many as 43 admitted patients on stretchers. That was in 2008, so that was 18 years ago. So hallway medicine is old hat, sad to say. Waiting room medicine is new, and it's a function of having no stretchers, having no place to put people. So what do you do when you have no place to put people? And let's first of all talk about why there's no place to put people. The issues, these are the chickens that are coming home to roost. These are, this is a problem that's not new, it's just more acute. It's decades in the making. We don't have enough long-term care facilities. We don't have enough home care services so that people might have an alternative to going to long-term care. They could go home to be cared for. I saw when I was in the UK a few years back a program that saw and treated people as if they were in a long-term care facility in their own homes. And so you can do that if you have the support staff, the services. Well, what do we have today with home care? We have people who are entitled, according to the system, to 20 hours a week for caregiving, showering and helping to getting up in the morning, sat down in front of their breakfast, and maybe turn down system at night where they do it in reverse, where they're put in bed. These are people who have, the system says you're entitled to 20 hours, but they can't get the 20 hours because there aren't enough people to do the 20 hours. That's the reality of what we have. So we don't have enough long-term care beds. That means that a certain fixed number of patients who are waiting for long-term care are in a hospital because they have no option but to stay there until they can go to a long-term care facility. So those stretchers are tied up until they go. Yeah. And they could be there for weeks or even months. The provinces, and you have to blame the provinces for this, they have either taken beds out of the system, hospital beds. In some cases, for good reasons, they were able to, we have the miracle of same-day surgery. That didn't exist 40 or 50 years ago. It exists now. You've got keyhole surgery, laparoscopic surgery, and people can go home the same day. But there's a limit to how beneficial laparoscopic surgery is going to be. As you get an older and sicker population, they end up remaining in hospital for a long, long time. And the system has taken beds out. The provinces have taken beds out of the system, or they have not increased the number of beds for the population. So, for instance, in Edmonton, they haven't had a new hospital built there in, 38 years? Yeah, 1988. Wow. 38 years since they had a new hospital in Edmonton. And per capita, we now have basically one bed, a little over one bed per 1,000, where 40 years ago we had 4 beds per 1,000. And so a lot, all those beds are occupied. Meanwhile, you have patient after patient arriving in the emergency department. When they get admitted, they need a bed. There's no bed upstairs, so they're going to occupy a stretcher. And that's why you have emergency physicians starting the day with 2 stretchers available, and they're supposed to see everybody. Hence the waiting room. The waiting room becomes the place where you wait before you can enter the sliding doors, and it now stretches sometimes into 24 hours. There are people in Quebec, there are mums of kids with ear infections, and they would rather pay a family doctor $150 for 15 minutes. This is private pay. It's the federal government's looking the other way. They're fining them, but they're the Quebec government. They'd rather pay the $150 than burn through 18 hours and all the sleep deprivation and miss a day of work. That's what we've come to.
I would say let's dig into that, because I wasn't going to bring it up, but I think we should talk about it.
Let's talk private.
Let's talk about it. Yeah. I think there's a lot of we have to, because I think there's a lot of conversation about public and privatized healthcare. Tell me, what are your main concerns? What are the patients that will be left behind? What are the patients that you won't see, or that you might see more of in the emergency department? If we go down the route of seeing more privatization, my biggest concern is you pull from the system. We don't have extra bodies. I'm like, oh no, at some point you might retire. Oh no, my colleague says, I can't deal with the stress of working in the emergency department. I'm going to leave. We keep on seeing studies, and just recently an article of how many more nurses are going to be leaving the workforce. And if we, have a public or private system, where do these people go? They're incentivized to go private, but then we do what? The public system.
So you've put your finger on a major issue, and that is that in this country, we don't have enough of the full gamut of healthcare providers. So if you have a fixed pool of healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, occupational therapists, etc., then if you develop a private for-profit system, you're going to siphon off people from the public system. And who can blame them? Because better hours, better pay, more joy, maybe less pressure, to just keep working beyond your capacity. I believe that there is a way to infuse the system with both public and private, but you have to start with a larger pool of people. You can't borrow or steal from one to the other. And that would be the situation that we have in Canada. That's why it wouldn't work without having more providers. Now, recently, a few months back, I went to Berlin. We're going to do a show, spoiler warning, we're doing a show in the next few weeks on the Charité Hospital in Berlin, where they have both public and private joint replacements, and they do more. This hospital does more joint replacements than any other hospital in the world, even India. And they have both public and private. The people who are in the private system, what they get for their extra money are amenities in the room. It looks more like a hotel room, and the view is better. They don't get better service. Why don't they get better service? Because there's a continuous turnover of younger residents who want to learn and want to work they have to work in the public system for 5 years before they can go to the private system, and And when they leave, there's another one and another one and another one that's coming into the system. So what we need, if we're going to infuse private in this country, is, first of all, an intelligent conversation about it, but we also need planning. And we can't have it just sneak up on us, because that's just not going to work. I think the sense that I'm getting from Alberta right now is that they're cutting the public system loose, and they're basically saying, we're going to, you got money, we're gonna get you what you want, because you can't get it fast enough in the public system. We're going to get it for you faster in the private system. And what will happen is that you're going to end up with the publicly funded system not being even more impoverished with staff, and the OR times, the wait times to get to surgery will be even longer than they are. Right now in Alberta, in the public system, you're waiting 2 to 3 years for a hip or a knee. And that's why people are paying $30,000. Their retirement savings. $30,000 will get you that joint replacement, but you have to go to another province to be able to do it. Although this Bill 11 that they're talking about in Alberta would allow doctors to work in both systems at the same time, public and private, in the province.
That's a little bit of a tricky situation for me. I think that, Alberta is not just trying to get rid of the healthcare system. They're trying to separate. Some people are trying to separate it altogether. So that's a whole other conversation.
An important one to have.
Definitely, but we can keep going. And I know we won't have enough time. But yes, we have to have a conversation about public and private, and we can't just say, no, we can't do this, because we see the wait times. But we have to talk about the finances, whether we're being underfunded, whether we as taxpayers are paying more for the same service, whether we're waiting longer. And then there's this whole other story that comes to mind. Does everybody know, I hope I say his name right, James Van Der Beeken. Does everybody know who he is? So sometimes people are like, oh, you know what? Private's better. What are they doing in the States? It's so much better. And then we hear stories of celebrities that have dwindled all of their life savings.
Not spoiler, but tangent, the star of Dawson's Creek,
yes,
who unfortunately passed away from end-stage colorectal cancer, one of those young folk who got cancer, and his family has a GoFundMe campaign right now to pay for the bills that the very expensive health care that he needed in the latter stages of his life.
Yeah, I think
very sad situation.
I think they were saying the meds were almost $10,000 a month.
Yeah,
and I think people don't think about how different our systems can be if we start moving towards privatization, and just being very thankful for the Canadian Health Act. And then we have to talk about, federal government's not really enforcing some of that stuff, but be thankful for the healthcare that we have here today.
Yeah.
It's not perfect.
And I don't want to be, and it's hard, it's hard these days to be a cheerleader when you see people waiting, being admitted to on a stretcher in a hallway in the emergency department for 5 days or 6 days. In fact, Dr. Trevor Jane, who's an emergency physician in PEI, told me the story of a patient who spent 30 days in the emergency department, and this is somebody who was admitted to a psychiatric service. That just seems like a very strange way to go. So yes, we have significant advantages compared to the United States, but we also have a lot of bureaucracy. We have a lot of, I don't think we're necessarily getting the best bang for the buck. Now, the United States has higher administrative costs than we do. So maybe we are achieving some economies that way, but we need an infusion of new ideas, and I think we can, I think we could be more efficient and more thoughtful about how we spend taxpayers' dollars.
I agree. I think the only thing I was saying was I'm still very proud that we have, and I think it's a system worth fighting for, to continue to fight for public healthcare services delivered that way as well. But yes,
I agree
we do have
completely.
work to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can clap. Be proud. Yeah. I want to circle it back to a story from your book. In the emergency department, it's so busy. And how do you, and I'm not going to spoil it because it was such a good story, a rare diagnosis that pops up, there's actually two. How do you balance that detective work with all of the things that are going on in the emergency department? How do you balance making sure that you can be that sleuth when knowing that, there's someone that's waiting, but understanding that you still have to do your differential diagnosis.
Would you be shocked if I told you that Dr. Google is lending us a big hand?
No.
and I have to tell you, I would say every patient who mentions Dr. Google begins with an apology. Oh, I'm sorry, I looked up Dr. Google, and I kind of put a hand on their shoulder and I say, you're being smart. As long as you kind of have spidey sense for what you might be fed in terms of websites that are basically advertising for a product. And as we are learning, Google is not a neutral search engine. It's directing you to very specific websites. But if you've got someone to help you curate what you're looking at, then it can be very helpful. And it's certainly, it has extended the careers of older emergency physicians like me, because I can become an instant expert in something because I know where to look and I know what's reputable. We have our own services. One's called Up to Date, but sometimes I just use plain old Google. Now, the search engines will help us pull in diagnoses that we wouldn't have thought of, including a rare diagnoses. What's really exciting, if we get it right, is that AI diagnosis will be very helpful. And in the book, I think the story is worth not spoiling, but I can tell you that the search, it involves a patient who had a 30-year search for the correct diagnosis. And he finally found it on his own by Googling his own rash. We told that story on White Coat Black Heart a few years ago, but I got to see him 10 years later with his daughter, who inherited the same condition. The exciting thing, the really intriguing thing, is that his name is Ian Stedman, he's a lawyer, and he is the first layperson to chair the ethics committee of the Institute of Genetics with the Canadian Institute for Health Information, for health research. And he is working with people who are programmers, people who develop algorithms. And he worked with somebody at the University of Toronto, told him the story of his very rare diagnosis. It's called Muckle-Wells syndrome. And this writer of algorithms for artificial intelligence said, why don't you give me all of the notes that you have, all the discharge summaries, the x-ray and lab work, and he fed them into his algorithm. And to make a long story short, had that algorithm existed 30 years ago, it would have cut the time that Ian Stedman needed to get a correct diagnosis of this ultra-rare condition called Muckle-Wells syndrome from 30 years down to about 5 or 6 appointments with a family doctor. So if we harness it correctly, it will be helpful. And certainly there's a lot of there are a lot of articles that are coming out right now on AI. And my suggestion is that you get acquainted with it and don't let it subsume you, but get acquainted with it, because I think you're going to discover that AI will be a great assistant to physicians in making a more accurate diagnosis and a lot quicker. There are dangers. The big one is privacy, the lack of privacy. That if you put your medical history onto an open source chatbot, then the rest of the world knows what ails you, and I don't think you want that. On the other hand, our healthcare system, I've long argued that our healthcare system has treated privacy as the third rail of innovation. Mm-hmm. It just, don't touch it, don't go there, don't touch it. So we have fax machines. Does everybody know what a fax machine is? Well, that's the number one method of communication between offices, clinics and offices. And I was told of the story of, and of course, fax machine. You never get the fax number wrong, do you? that there was a microbiology lab in New Brunswick that was sending the results of sexually transmitted infection test results to an auto body shop by mistake. So, those mistakes never happen. But
Maybe they saw the word body and was like, oh, this is right. Oh, I
Maybe,
don't know.
maybe.
That is awful. But I do want to talk a little bit more about AI since you touched on it, because I think it's actually a really important question. Let's start with this first one, specific to, the fact that, we are searching. More people are using AI, more people are using chatbots. Is the future of healthcare a patient just like myself or anybody in the audience coming in with a differential diagnosis and saying, hey, this is what I have?
not only will you come in with a differential diagnosis, you might come in with the correct diagnosis. Now, of course, we have this thing, you have a working diagnosis and a differential diagnosis, and it's important, that's our method. The idea is to have plan B and C, D, E in case the diagnosis that we think you have is incorrect, because that happens. And there are, when it comes to rare diagnoses, and Ian Stedman talked about that, the rarer the diagnosis, the more likely AI is going to help you nail it a lot sooner. That's going to happen. I can tell you another thing that's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. You're going to have much more diagnostics available at your home, where you're going to be able to give the equivalent of a blood sample. You'll be able to upload it to some kind of a secure website, and it will be able to do a blood panel before you've ever gotten to the emergency department. That's going to happen. We're going to have, I talked about having my pocket ultrasound. The next step would be to have disposable ultrasound probes that are like adhesive. You stick them on according to the directions, and you plug it into your smartphone, and it gets uploaded. It will capture the image, and it will send that image to a place where somebody can make use of that information. Maybe, in fact, whatever can be looked at by a human being, like an X-ray, an MRI, an ultrasound, your eyes, your fundoscopic, looking at the back of your eyes with an ophthalmoscope, a biopsy sample, a breast cancer biopsy, like a breast biopsy, a prostate biopsy. Anything that can be looked at with the human eye can be looked at more accurately with AI. So that's going to happen. There will be missteps, but that's going to happen, and it's going to change how we work. I think that the next generation of physicians, for instance, are going to be more curators of information than the finders of facts.
That's very interesting. I would really love to hear some other physicians' thoughts on all that, because that's a huge change for medicine too, right? Do you think they'd be much more receptive to having that conversation and seeing that huge change and that shift to becoming more of a curator?
Yes and no. I think so. First of all, the people who grow up with it, the people who go to school when that's their fundamental education, they'll be fine with it. But are we going to reach the point where we don't need human beings, to look at a biopsy? I'm going to be controversial. I'm going to say yes. That you might have human beings supervising the algorithm, but not peering down a microscope of every sample. They might be peering down a random sampling to make sure that the algorithm is working. And I'm not just speculating right now. There have been many studies, a growing number of studies, that have shown that when an AI algorithm knows the criteria to look for, and a human being had to help them with that, then they're able to diagnose breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, or an X-ray, MRI, or a CT abnormality with a higher degree of accuracy than a human being can do. Now, what's interesting is, recently I was reading that even the programmers are using AI to do the programming, to do the coding for them. They're not doing the coding on their own right now. So things are changing exponentially, and it's both exciting, it's scary, but it's also exciting.
Yeah, I do want to quickly touch on the dangers, like you had mentioned.
Right.
One of the things that I actually noticed is, particularly with AI, because it's us putting information in, there are biases, there is room for error, and it's almost like that thing that I would say to women, for example, buying online ultrasounds when you're pregnant. I'd be like, don't do it, because there's things that you can miss. You might put that ultrasound to your tummy and say, oh, there's still a heartbeat, so everything's fine. But you come in, and then we see that there's other issues. So what are some of the dangers that you might see in relation to AI?
So first of all, the privacy issue is real. And I would say that if you're going to use a chatbot. There are some recognized uses for chatbots right now. If you ask a chatbot for a list of reputable, like evidence-based websites to deal with a certain condition, you'll get them, and you'll be amazed at how accurate they are. If you want recipes for Mediterranean diet or for a diabetic diet, it's great for that. If you have a complicated diagnosis and you want to have it put in language that an 8-year-old would understand, or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, then AI is really, really good for that. What I would not do, there's a few things I wouldn't do. One of them is I wouldn't say I have an elevated PSA, prostatic specific antigen. What do I do about that? Because you're telling the world you've got an elevated PSA, and if you're American, that would be a big mistake. You might ask for, because if you're receiving insurance, you might find that you're disqualified, or you might have a pre-existing. You might find out that they say in retrospect you had a pre-existing condition and that it's being disallowed. So that's one thing. You've got to be very cagey about how you put that information out there, but in general don't put out private information about your health, because other people can be observing. The second thing that I would not do is enter into a chat bot saying, I'm having chest pain, what do you think it could be? Because Amie, you kind of alluded to it. Chatbots are designed to be sycophantic. They agree with you. So if you say, this isn't something I need to be worried about, it might actually lead you on and say, no, this isn't something you need to be worried about. Maybe you need to be very worried about it. Yeah. And so don't use it for open-ended diagnostic questions. You can ask it a question, like a fact-based question, like what's the average 5-year survival for this disease or that disease? You'll get an accurate answer. But if you enter into a kind of an iterative question-answer process with a chatbot, it will probably direct you, or eventually it might be terrific, 5 or 10 years from now. But the present iterations of open source chatbots will sometimes lead you away from the correct diagnosis, and you won't know why. You won't know why your doctor or your nurse practitioner asked you a question that seemed like it was out of left field, but they had a brainwave that they saw a patient who had very similar symptoms 20 years ago, and this is the question they wished they'd asked then, and now they're asking it. And it seems like it's out of left field. That's the human brain at work. And I don't think anybody believes that AI can mimic a human brain. The other area for which I would not use a chatbot today, I'd stay tuned, is if you're looking for mental health counseling.
Yep.
And in the United States, I looked at a study that found that 20% of people college age, like 18 to 25, are using a chatbot for mental health advice. The problem with that is that, again, it's sycophantic. So we did a show on White Coat Black Art about AI psychosis. It's not a real diagnosis, but there is an expert who's both an expert in AI and coding and a psychiatrist, and he began to see a series of patients who were using AI chatbots who developed all the features of psychosis, a thought disorder. Either they had delusions of godhood or grandeur. So they thought that they had developed a universal algorithm security system, or a universal theory of relativity. And you ask the chatbot, this seems crazy. Am I right? Am I on to? And the chatbot is helping them program. It's helping them develop an algorithm or helping them develop an app. And the chatbot, because it's trained to agree with you, to keep you pulled into the conversation by agreeing with you, it might say, oh, no, you're not crazy. No, you're right. And there have been reports of people who've said, I think I'm being followed by the CIA. Am I crazy? Oh, no, you're not. No, this is such an amazing, innovative idea that it's not surprising that you're being followed. You need to be very careful. And instead of saying, I think you need help, I think you need to go to the hospital and tell them some of the thoughts that you're having right now. And you know, the makers, the programmers of open source AI like ChatGPT are listening. They're making their programs less sycophantic. They're putting guardrails in, but there is a risk.
Yeah, I'm glad that you kind of discussed an open, and we've had that open conversation about, you know, the pros and the cons to AI, and it kind of takes us into this next piece in terms of talking about innovation and what we might be able to see in the future. So, you know, after decades of being on the front line and seeing the system on edge, what is the one thing from your book that still makes you excited to continue to put your scrubs on? And I think you started your casino shift quite early, actually, in your book. What makes you excited to continue to do medicine? What keeps you going?
There is
under 2 minutes.
In under 2 minutes, absolutely. That's not hard. It's two things. It's the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives very quickly, and you know, we work on a shorter time frame than our colleagues in internal medicine, but you know, seeing people in distress and being able to help them, even if it's to comfort them when they have a life-limiting illness, to be there to see them and have them see us, to make that human connection. That's what keeps me going. The other thing that keeps me going are my younger colleagues who are finding these gaps in the system and are filling them. So, you know, my colleague at Sinai, Dr. Catherine Varner, is developing what she calls, you know, it's one of these jargon terms, wraparound care for women who have a miscarriage. And that there's often a tremendous gap there. The emotional toll of a miscarriage is seldom dealt with or talked about in the emergency department. She's filling that gap. Dr. Kirat Graywall is developing pathways for people who are diagnosed with cancer in the emergency department, which is happening frequently. Instead of being kind of sent into this abyss or falling between the cracks, is designing systems, you know, during surveys to find out where the gaps are and filling those gaps to create faster pathways, smoother pathways, so that people who are diagnosed can get expeditious treatment instead of being sent out into the abyss and hoping that they get the clinic appointment, which often doesn't happen. And you know, the next one we're gonna work on is finding care for women who need to see a gynecologist, which is, you know, the access to gynecologic surgery is abysmal right now. Yeah. And that's something, so that gives me a lot of hope for the future, that as long as we continue to be passionate about trying to plug the holes, then we're going to keep working at it. Yeah,
that's what we need. We need to have continued passion, drive, seeing that there is innovation, there's room for improvement, and that, you know, I think we are going in the right direction. I know that there's a lot of challenges, but I know that there's a lot of good people like yourself that is going to continue to do the work and continue to point out the gaps. And you know, maybe there's a surprise for us later on in the future in terms of what you might be doing, Dr. Goldman. But before we go, I know we have 1 minute, and I want to do something fun.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready for fun.
We're going to do casino round rapid fire questions.
Okay.
I know a little bit more about Brian than you do. Black coffee or double-double?
Oh. Neither. Black coffee.
Black coffee.
Easy. Yeah.
Casino shift or traditional ED shift?
Oh, casino.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cold pizza or hot meal?
Cold pizza.
Podcast or live radio?
Oh, I don't do any live radio. I think it would be live radio.
Okay.
Yeah.
IO or IV?
IO, intraosseous. It's a lot easier to do, but you don't want to know how we do it. It's pretty violent.
The pit or ER?
The pit.
Gut feeling or AI diagnostics?
I'm going to go with my gut right now.
Okay. So now we're going to move into our Star Trek questions. Are you ready?
Okay. All right.
McCoy or Crusher?
Oh, you're so mean. McCoy.
McCoy,
just because I'm old enough for it to be McCoy.
The medical tricorder or the dermal regenerator?
Dermal regenerator.
Ooh, instant healing. The hypospray or the traditional needle?
Hypospray.
Hypospray. Vulcan logic or Betazoid empathy?
Impossible choice. Betazoid empathy.
All right, and last, Captain Kirk's intuition or Captain Picard's diplomacy?
Oh, God. Intuition.
Excellent. Thank
Kirk's
you.
intuition.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having this conversation with me about the casino shift.